In this unit, we'll be talking about some of the genres of the Old Testament. Our authors begin by giving us 4 texts and ask us to identify those. The first text on the page 417 is, "Oh, the grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill, and he marched them down again. And when they were up, they were up. And when they were down, they were down. And when they were only halfway up, they were neither up nor down." Now, this is a children's song, and it is meant to be sung with action. The second text, "Do you solemnly swear that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" And the implied answer is, "I do." Now, this is a text that would be used in a courtroom where the bailiff is swearing in a witness. The third text, "Give a man a fish, and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime." Now, this is a common saying that you often hear in a general group. The fourth text, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, he goes on and quotes a little bit more than this, but from this we understand that it is part of the Constitution. And so this would be a very solemn reading within a context. Now, there's another way that we can illustrate this. We all recognize what these 4 texts are, but we have a different way of presenting the same material. And for this, I would like to use a local paper that is called the Tulsa Beacon. Now, the Tulsa Beacon is published once a week. It is a conservative newspaper, which is an oddity in our common left-wing environment in which we live. And in this, we see that there are several different genres. On the first page is state and local news, which continues on pages 2 and 3. Notice that part of page 2 is a large advertisement. Pages 4 and 5 are filled with editorials and letters to the editor. Page 6 also has quotes from the Tulsa World, our major far-left newspaper, entitled, "Do these opinions represent your family's values?" And of course, we would have to answer, no, they do not. Page 7 is the sports page, and page 8 has recipes. Then there is a second section. It begins with movie reviews and advertisements. Page 2B has articles by Billy Graham, Focus on the Family, and Dave Ramsey. 3B has Charles Riggs. Pages 4 and 5 have classified ads. Pages 6B through 8B have comics, cryptograms, Sudoku, and crossword puzzles. Movie reviews are also on the final page. As you can see, many different items are found in these pages, but it is easy to distinguish one from the other, and we do this automatically. We can tell a news item from a comic or an ad. We do this whenever we read a newspaper. Now, today we have a challenge to understand biblical genre because of geographical and chronological distance. They lived in an urban agricultural society over 2,000 years ago. But we share some common experiences, and we have modern literary roots. So knowing genre helps us to interpret a passage. Now, let's take a look at Old Testament narratives. An Old Testament narrative genre may contain other genres within it. And the simplest biblical narrative is the report. Now, a report is a brief, self-contained narration, usually in the third-person style, about a single event or situation in the past. Now, Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried under the oak outside Bethel. So it was named Alon Bachuth. Now, this is a comment about Rebekah's nurse, and this would be considered a narrative. An anecdote is an event or experience in life of the person, and this is usually private. It's biography mainly. For instance, in Genesis 37:2, it says, "This is the account of Jacob's family line." And so when it gives you that comment, it means what follows is going to be about Jacob. A memoir is a report written in the first person about events. Ezra and Nehemiah are both good examples of a memoir. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. So that is at the beginning of the book of Nehemiah. A battle report is a military clash, and in Genesis 14:13 through 16, we see this. It says, "A man who had escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. Now Abram was living near the great trees of Mamre the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol and Aner, all of whom were allied with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and the other people." So this is an account, a battle that actually took place with Abram in the lead. A dream report details an individual's experience in a dream. And one that you're all familiar with probably is the dream of Joseph. Joseph dreamed that they were binding sheaves in a field, he and his brothers, 11 brothers, and his sheaf stood up, and all of theirs bowed down to him. And then he had another dream later where the sun and the moon, representing his mother and father, and 11 stars bowed down to him. Now this was telling what was going to happen to Joseph. And his brothers hated it because of what it implied. Then we have an epiphany report. This is where God or an angel appears to an individual. In Joshua 5:13, now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, Are you for us or for our enemies? And of course, the angel answered, I'm not for either. And then he goes ahead and speaks to Joshua about the coming battle. Historical stories have more elaboration than reports. Sometimes there are several different genres included. Abram in Egypt, where there was a famine in the land of Canaan, so he went to Egypt to live for a while, and there he told the people that his wife Sarah was his sister, and this would try to keep him from being killed and his wife taken by someone else. There's also the story of Saul at Jabesh Gilead, and this is when he was coming home from plowing, and the news came to him that Nahash was besieging the city of Jabesh Gilead. And when he heard the details, he sent word that he would come. This is an interesting tale because only in the Dead Sea Scrolls does the preliminary of this appear. It is not found in our regular Old Testament, and that is where Nahash had already conquered most of that country and had put out the right eye of everyone. Those who had survived went to Jabesh Gilead, and there he came and was intending to do the same thing to them. But Saul was able to free them. And then there is history, and this is a lengthy account that focuses on a particular subject or historical era. This includes Kings and Chronicles. Now, what are the principles for interpreting reports? Well, first of all, we should focus on the main subject and how it contributes to the whole, to the themes of the larger context. We can deduce theological themes from larger context. Reports stress facts. For instance, in Joshua 12, there is a list of kings conquered by Joshua. And this shows God's awesome power. Now that is a theological theme embedded in the context. Reports make their points indirectly. In 1 Kings 22, Micaiah ben Imlah is persecuted by King Ahab. The prophets have been called, and there are over 400 of them. And then Micaiah is called. And at first Micaiah agrees with them, and then he says, no, that's not right. When Micaiah gives an indication that God does not favor Ahab, Ahab then says that they should take him into the city, give him only bread and water until he returns safely. And then Micaiah says, well, if you return safely, then I haven't told the truth. The reader must analyze the emphasis of the individual reports to see what they share in common. For instance, we have Kings that evaluates the monarchy as a spiritual disaster. Chronicles covers much the same history, but it speaks only about Judah, and it gives a positive spiritual legacy, the proper temple worship in Judah. So even though they cover some of the similar material, their emphasis is completely different. Then there is the heroic narrative, a series of episodes that focus on the life and exploits of a hero. The book of Judges is a good example. The life of Moses is perhaps one of the best examples of this genre. Also in Genesis 1 through 11, this is considered a cosmic epic because it's telling us the history that involved the whole cosmos. And then from Genesis 12 through 36, it's an ancestral epic because it's dealing with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then we have a prophet story, and these can be seen in Elijah, Elisha, and Daniel in the first 6 chapters. Faithfulness in the face of persecution or in the face of pressures is what is dealt with in the prophet story. And what are the principles of interpretation for the heroic narrative and the prophet stories? Well, we focus again on the life of the main character, whether an individual, a family, or a nation. We ask ourselves 2 questions. What model of relationship is shown with the individual and God? And the worldview, is it a critical view or does it discredit the individual? What values are present that the principal character represents? What larger themes may be involved? For instance, Elijah and Israel's disloyalty to Yahweh in favor of Baal, or Daniel in Babylon. Daniel has been raised as a good Jew, and now he is faced with the food that is going to be given to him, and he asks not to receive the food or the wine, but vegetables and water. So this is a good example of how he is facing pressure. The application of these narratives should focus on analogous situations between the biblical character and Christianity today. We have the example of people overcoming infertility in the book of Genesis with Rebekah and also with Rachel. Then we have comedy. Comedy is a narrative whose plot has a happy ending. Esther, Ruth, Joseph are all examples of comedy. A comedy is not meant to be funny. It merely turns out well in the end. And for the principles of interpretation of comedy, since plot drives a comedy, the interpretation must trace how tragedy turns to triumph. Is there character development that merits attention? We discern what role God plays in the story. Is it direct or indirect? Discern the comedy's main themes. For instance, the story of Joseph. He was a slave in Egypt and then became second only to Pharaoh. This shows God's guidance. In the case of Esther, God takes care of his people. It's interesting that God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, but it is clear that he is behind everything that happens. The application follows from the comedy's main themes. And when we make application, we should have analogous situations. Then the farewell speech. This is an address in the first person before the death. We see this in the case of Jacob when he speaks to his sons before he dies. And what principles do we apply? Well, first, what makes the speech historically pivotal? Why give the speech at all? What does the speaker urge his audience to do? How does it contribute to the larger context? For instance, 1 Samuel 12, where Samuel is speaking, and we have the choice of Saul as the next king. This is an introduction to the whole book of Samuel. And so we look for contemporary situations when we try to make application. Interpreting a sample narrative, we can find this in Judges 7, 1 through 15. Yahweh's power, not huge troop strength, achieved the victory. This is the story of Gideon again. We know he's the one that put out the fleece to see what God's will is, and he does that twice. And then he is told to diminish the size of his army, and he goes from about 32,000 down to 300. And then if he is still not sure, then he is to go to the camp of the enemy, and there is a dream report that marks the dramatic turning point. It convinces Gideon. And in this story of Gideon, there are also embedded genres as well. Then there are popular proverbs and blessings. Saul was trying to get hold of David to put him to death, and he sent some soldiers to find him and bring him in. When they reached Samuel and David, they began to prophesy. He sent some more, and they prophesied. Then Saul went himself, and he prophesied. Then from this experience comes the statement, is Saul also among the prophets? They had no connection of Saul with the prophets until this particular event. But that's life. We have riddles. And the one from Samson at his wedding feast, he asked the men to solve the riddle, and if they did, he would give them each a set of clothes. And the riddle was, out of the eater, something to eat, out of the strong, something sweet. And of course the answer was the lion and the honey. There are also riddles in Daniel, chapter 5, verse 25. This is when Belshazzar is king, and he sees the writing on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Farsin. And they have no idea what it means, but Daniel is able to read it and to apply it to Belshazzar. Then there are fables. Now, fables are where other than human beings take part. And Jotham tells a parable about his brother, his half-brother, and the people of Shechem. And this is where they are trying to pick a leader. And they go to the olive tree, and he turns them down. The vine, and it turns them down. And the cedar, it turns him down. But then he goes to the bush. And the bush says if he really wants him to be the king, then they need to take comfort under his shade. Another fable is told by Jehoash to Amaziah. Jehoash was the king of Israel, and Amaziah was king of Judah. And Amaziah said to the cedar in Lebanon, give your daughter for my wife. Now, Amaziah is described as a thistle. Then it says an animal came along and stepped on the thistle and destroyed it. Then there are also parables. A very well-known one is that is told by Nathan to David after he had sinned with Bathsheba. And this is about a lamb that a person had and raised as a pet. And then when a visitor came to the rich man, he took the poor man's lamb and sacrificed it rather than using one of his own. This so incensed David that he says, "That man shall die." And then Nathan turned around and said, "You are the man." So the parable worked very well in illustrating who the victim was and who the person is that perpetrated that crime. Then there are songs. We know that Moses wrote a song in chapter 15 of Exodus, and that Deborah wrote a song in Judges 5, and Hannah wrote a song after the birth of Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 2. And we also have Jonah from the belly of the large fish, where he praises God for rescuing him. Then there are lists. Joshua, in Joshua 12, lists all of the kings that he destroyed. This was designed to show that God had given him victory over all of these kings. Now, what are the principles for interpretation? Because these are embedded genres. Well, you look to the larger context because the genre forms a component. How does the genre contribute to the meaning of the whole? An illustration is in Genesis 5, which is basically a genealogy. It tells us much time had passed and there was increasing sinfulness. So the age when the person fathered a son was given, and then the total lifespan of the person is mentioned. Now let's talk about law in Israel and the forms of Old Testament legal material. There are two types of law that appear. One is casuistic law. This is similar to the law that is found throughout the ancient Near East. It begins with, if such and such is the case, then this is the penalty. Then there is the apodictic law. This is not found elsewhere. It's found in the Ten Commandments and is unconditional law, where God actually writes the law on the tablet with his finger. It's the Ten Commandments, or what we call the lex talionis. The lex talionis is how you should avenge a person who has been wronged. And it is difficult to know whether this means in the way that they treated you, you should treat them, or if this is a damper on how much you can do. That you can only go this far and no more. There are legal series, several groups of small number of laws phrased in a similar style. Rarely do you find a single law by itself. Now, what were the laws they needed for every day? Of robbery, boundaries, for fire, for property, and from the field. A person could take what was growing in the field and eat it, but he couldn't take it in a basket. So you had a restriction on what can be eaten from another person's field. There was both priestly law and lay law. And the principles of interpretation, it is best understood in a covenant framework. The personal demands of Israel's sovereign Lord is the context in which we should view these laws. How does the law apply today? Consider the cultural background. We no longer live as they did. Most of us do not live on a farm or on land and raise our own food. And to fulfill a law in biblical times was to bring it to completion. As Jesus states in Matthew, on the Sermon on the Mount, he says that I have not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law. Some laws retain literal validity for Christians. For instance, our command to love the Lord our God with all our heart, to love our neighbor as ourselves, that is still just as binding as it was when it was uttered. The New Testament sometimes makes laws stricter. The laws concerning divorce and remarriage are stricter in the New Testament than they are in the Old Testament. The laws may teach timeless truths. And one of these is that God takes sin seriously. Now let's talk a little bit about poetry. We've already talked about some poetry, but how about in this context of the genres? Well, we have prayers and we have thanksgiving, both given in poetic form. We have a protest, for instance, in Psalm 86. Hear me, Lord, and answer me, for I am poor and needy. Guard my life, for I am faithful to you. Save your servant who trusts in you. Arrogant foes are attacking me, O God. Ruthless people are trying to kill me. They have no regard for you. Then we have also imprecatory poetry. This is hyperbole. This is like Psalm 109, where you have the children are destroyed, perhaps by knocking their head against a stone. Then we have descriptive poetry. Who is God? What is his character? What are his qualities? We have a penitential psalm in Psalm 51. This is where David repents for his sin with Bathsheba. And then we have love that is expressed in Psalm 45. It speaks about a royal wedding. And then we have Song of Songs, which is a love story. It tells about a young couple from the beginning and how they grow in their love for one another. In 2 Samuel 1, we have a dirge. This is written by David in honor of Saul and Jonathan. And then we have wisdom psalms, and these are psalms that are written by the wise men of Israel. They do not claim that they are from God, but by observation, they tell us their experience and what they think happened. And then we have liturgies, a response in Psalm 136, where you have the same phrase repeated again and again. And a liturgy is a psalm or some kind of activity in which there is a response from the hearer. Well, that gives us many different genres that we have in the Old Testament. and we will be talking about more of them in the next unit.